The sun had not yet cleared the sandstone ridges when Miss Eleanor Briggs stepped onto the mission porch. A faint chill still clung to the air, smelling of sage and distant rain. In the east, the desert was beginning to glow, pale pink spreading over the mesas like slow fire. It was a kind of silence she had never known before coming west, a silence that held its breath between heartbeats. She drew her shawl tighter and gazed toward the open plain. The mission, a handful of adobe buildings crouched around a dry well, stood at the edge of nothingness. Beyond the last fence post stretched miles of dust rock and shimmering air. The world, she thought, felt too large for one small woman and a dozen students. The children were still asleep inside, curled in their bunks. Today she was to begin the new term, teaching English, arithmetic, and scripture to Apache and settler children alike. Or so the Army superintendent had promised. But already Eleanor had learned that promises evaporated quickly in the desert. The soldiers came and went. The traders argued, and the local families looked at her with unreadable eyes. That morning, as the first sunbeams struck the chapel cross, she noticed movement on the horizon. A dark speck, faint at first, grew steadily larger. She shaded her eyes. A rider, alone, her breath caught. Few men rode these roads at dawn without a purpose, and fewer still rode alone. The soldiers at Fort Lowell were stationed 20 miles away. No one was due to visit for another week. She listened, hoofbeats steady and deliberate, carrying through the thin morning air. Instinct told her to retreat inside, but curiosity held her fast. She had come west to teach courage as much as grammar, she reminded herself. Still, her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the porch rail. The rider came into view, a tall man astride a dun horse, both coated in the reddish dust of long travel. His hair was black, tied with leather. Sunlight flashed on the metal badge pinned to his shirt, the crossed sabers of a U.S. Army scout. Yet everything else about him, his buckskin leggings, the beaded armband, the straightness of his posture, spoke of Apache blood. He dismounted without hurry. His movements were economical, almost silent, as if he belonged to the stillness around him. When he raised his head, Eleanor caught his eyes for the first time. They were dark, steady, and carried a weight that made her throat tighten. "Good morning," she began, her voice more brittle than she wished. "Can I help you, sir?" For a moment he didn't answer. He looked past her toward the small chapel door, toward the faint smoke curling from the cookhouse chimney. Then he spoke, his accent low but precise. "I seek the schoolmistress, Miss Briggs. I'm she." He inclined his head slightly. "Then I bring word from the fort." He reached into his coat and drew out a folded paper, but did not hand it over immediately. "They said you found something near here, something you should not keep." The phrasing chilled her, though she could not yet say why. "I don't understand," she said. "I've found many things since I came. Broken tools, bird nests, bits of pottery. The desert is full of lost objects." His gaze remained fixed, unblinking. "This one was not lost," he said. "It was taken." Eleanor felt the words settle into her like dust, heavy and fine. She thought of the bundle in the chapel, the small, feverish child she had discovered 2 nights ago, left at her doorstep without a sound. She had told no one except the mission nurse. How could this stranger know? She forced a smile. "Perhaps you had better come inside," she said, gesturing toward the open door. "The sun will be up soon and the air grows warm quickly." He nodded once, tethered his horse, and followed her to the threshold. As they crossed into the shadowed chapel, Eleanor sensed the fragile calm of the morning breaking, as though the desert itself had inhaled and would not exhale again until something irreversible had happened. Behind them, the first light of day flared on the ridges, setting the stones aflame. The stillness was gone. A hawk wheeled overhead, crying once, sharp and distant. Eleanor closed the door and turned to face the stranger fully. Dust drifted between them in the slanted light, tiny motes spinning like gold. She had wanted adventure, purpose, redemption, but now, staring at the Apache scout's solemn face, she wondered if the desert was about to grant her wish in a way she could never have imagined. Inside the chapel, the air was cooler but dense, scented faintly of candle wax and desert dust. Shafts of gold light slipped through the narrow windows, illuminating the wooden benches and the small altar draped in a sun-faded cloth. Every creak of the floorboard seemed magnified, as if the building itself were listening. The Apache scout removed his hat and stood motionless near the door. His eyes moved slowly across the room. The crucifix, the chalkboard with half-erased words, the shelf of battered primers. Eleanor realized, with a strange mix of defiance and embarrassment, that this was the entire measure of her mission school, the sum of her calling, her bravery, her loneliness. She gestured toward a bench. "Please sit," she said. He did not move at first. "I will stand," he replied quietly. His English carried the rhythm of someone who had learned the language out of necessity, not choice. Eleanor clasped her hands before her, trying to steady them. "You said you bring word from the fort?" "Yes." He withdrew the folded paper again and handed it to her. The parchment was stained from travel, the ink blurred by sweat. She recognized the signature of Colonel Alden, the commanding officer at Fort Lowell, a man who regarded her mission as a civilizing experiment, useful only as long as it stayed out of his way. The note was brief. "Miss Briggs, should a scout named Nantan arrive, he has orders to question you regarding certain matters of tribal concern. Cooperate fully. Do not act independently. The safety of the mission depends on it." Her stomach tightened. "Matters of tribal concern," she repeated softly, glancing up at him. "What does that mean?" He hesitated before answering. "Something taken from our people. Something that was here." "I assure you," she said, folding the paper, "I've taken nothing. I'm here to teach, not to—" He interrupted, his tone still calm but edged. "Not to what, Miss Briggs? Not to interfere?" The words stung because they were true. From the moment she had arrived, every lesson she taught, the alphabet, hymns, the discipline of quiet sitting, was an interference. A reshaping of lives that had once belonged to another rhythm. "Still," she said, "I've tried to bring peace here." He looked at her then, truly looked, and she felt the full weight of his gaze. "Peace does not come from taking children from their mothers," he said. Her heart stopped. "Children?" He nodded once. 2 nights ago, a child vanished from our camp near the river. Her mother was sick. We searched. We found tracks, a woman's footprints leading toward this place. Eleanor's throat went dry. "A woman?" "A white woman," he said, voice firm. "And a horse from the fort. The child was not dead. She was taken." The silence that followed pressed in on her like the desert heat. She wanted to deny it, to claim ignorance. But she remembered that night too clearly. The faint cry at her door, the feverish face of the baby wrapped in deerskin, the desperate note scrawled in a trembling hand. Keep her safe. No name. No explanation. Only fear. "I don't know who left her," Eleanor whispered. "I thought she'd been abandoned." He stepped closer and she could feel the stillness between them, heavy as stone. "Apache mothers do not abandon their children," he said. The certainty in his voice struck something inside her, a truth she had been trying not to face. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, rattling the chapel shutters. Dust swirled through the slanted sunlight, ghost-like. Eleanor thought of the soldiers' warnings. Do not trust the scouts. They are neither ours nor theirs. They will lie to get what they want. Yet there was no deceit in this man's voice. "Only loss, I'm sorry," she said, barely audible. "If what you say is true, then the child, he interrupted, belongs with her people." For a long time, neither of them moved. The only sound was the faint cooing from behind the partition, the small sound that had haunted her nights. She realized then that he must have already heard it. His shoulders stiffened. Eleanor's voice faltered. "You should know. She's ill. Weak. I've done what I can." His expression softened. Just slightly, like the edge of a stone smoothed by years of rain. "Then you have done well," he said. "But now she must go home." She wanted to believe it would be that simple, but a chill crept through her. She remembered the colonel's letter, the warning not to act independently. If she gave up the child without orders, it would be seen as betrayal. And out here, betrayal could mean a bullet. The scout seemed to sense her hesitation. "You fear your soldiers," he said quietly. She looked at him surprised. "You fear them too," she replied. He gave a faint, humorless smile. "I do not fear them. I remember them." Outside, the sun had climbed higher, casting the desert in a harsh, merciless glow. Inside the little chapel, 2 strangers stood at the edge of a choice neither yet dared to name. The faint cooing behind the partition broke the silence like a secret too long withheld. Eleanor's eyes darted toward the curtained alcove where she had placed the cradle 2 nights before. The sound came again, a soft whimper, rising, falling. The Apache scout, Nantan, turned his head slightly. His expression did not change, but the shift in his body, a stillness that deepened, told her he had already guessed the truth. Eleanor took a step toward the partition, her voice trembling. "She's sleeping," she said, though it wasn't true. The baby had been restless all night, fevered, her tiny fists curling and uncurling as though trying to hold on to life itself. "I would see her," Nantan said quietly. Eleanor hesitated. The colonel's warning echoed again in her mind. Do not yield the child. Await instruction. She had thought the order absurd at the time. Now, facing the man before her, it felt like a sentence hanging over both their heads. "I only meant to help her," she said. "When I found her, she was cold, nearly gone. I did what any human being would do." "Where?" His tone was low, deliberate. "At my doorstep," she answered. "Wrapped in a deer hide, no note. No name." His eyes flickered, a shadow crossing them. "And you told no one?" "I told the mission nurse," she said quickly. "She said to wait until someone came. No one did." He nodded slowly, as if each word confirmed what he had feared. Then, without asking permission, he moved toward the alcove. Eleanor wanted to stop him, to protect the fragile calm that remained. But her strength failed. She stood frozen as he reached out and pulled the curtain aside. The cradle was small, hand-carved by one of the local fathers years ago. It looked almost too delicate to hold a child. The baby stirred inside, her dark hair damp with sweat, her tiny chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Nantan knelt beside the cradle. For a moment, all the harsh lines in his face softened. He touched the edge of the blanket with a kind of reverence. Eleanor felt her throat tighten. "You know her," she said, though it was not a question. He did not answer at once. His hand trembled as he turned back the deerskin covering. Around the baby's wrist, faint but unmistakable, was a string of small white shell beads. His breath caught. "This," he whispered, "belongs to my clan." Eleanor felt the words like a gust of wind through the room, invisible but powerful enough to steal her breath. "Your clan?" He nodded, his voice raw. "These shells are from the Salt River. No one outside our families wears them. The child is of the Eagle people. My people." She sank to her knees beside him, heart hammering. "Then she is your—" He looked at her, eyes glistening with a pain that words could not carry. "My daughter." The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor gripped the edge of the cradle to steady herself. 100 thoughts collided in her mind. The mysterious knock at her door, the feverish infant, the unseen mother who had vanished into the desert night. "She was left with me," Eleanor said softly. "Someone must have trusted me to keep her safe." "Her mother," he said, voice hoarse. "She would have come here if she were desperate." "If the soldiers were near, then why didn't she stay?" He looked away. "Because they would have killed her." The words hung heavy in the air. Eleanor's eyes stung, though she could not tell whether from grief or guilt. She reached down and touched the baby's hand. Impossibly small, warm now beneath her fingers. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I didn't know she was yours." "You were kind," he said, his tone gentler now. "You kept her alive. For that I owe you." He rose slowly, cradling the child in his arms. The baby made a small sound. Not quite a cry, more a sigh, as if recognizing the heartbeat against her ear. Eleanor felt tears rise, unbidden. "She belongs with her people," Nantan said again, but softer now, almost pleading. Eleanor's hands trembled at her sides. "If the soldiers find out I gave her to you, they'll say I've betrayed the mission. They'll call it treason. Would you rather betray your heart?" he asked quietly. The question struck her harder than she expected. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the silence it left was worse, the kind that waits for a choice to be made. Eleanor turned toward the window, watching the light creep across the desert floor. The horizon shimmered like a blade. When she spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Then God help us both." The chapel seemed to hold its breath. Dust motes drifted in the shafts of morning light, swirling between the two figures like silent witnesses. Eleanor's hands remained clasped tightly, knuckles white, as she stared at the man holding the infant who was now undeniably his daughter. Then the words came, sharp like a whip cracking through the tension. "What is this, miss?" Nantan cried, his voice rising, but not with anger. Something deeper. A raw mixture of disbelief and desperation trembled in each syllable. Eleanor's stomach clenched. She had rehearsed every explanation in her mind, every conceivable excuse, but now that the moment had arrived, words faltered on her tongue. She could feel the weight of the child, the urgency of the situation pressing down on her like the desert sun at high noon. I found her," she stammered. "She was left at my door. I thought she needed care." Nantan's eyes, dark and unwavering, bore into hers. "Left at your door?" he repeated. The disbelief in his voice cut sharper than any blade. "Do you know what you have done? Do you know where she comes from?" Eleanor swallowed hard, her pulse hammering in her ears. She did know, in some deep, instinctive way, that the child belonged somewhere else. Somewhere beyond the adobe walls, beyond the small, dusty chapel, beyond the fragile safety she had provided. But admitting it felt like surrender, like confessing failure. I didn't know she was yours," she whispered. "You didn't know?" Nantan's voice rose again, but it was edged with anguish, not fury. "Do you think the desert leaves children unattended without reason? Do you think our families abandon their own?" The words struck Eleanor like stones against a window pane. Each syllable resonated in the silent room. She looked down at the child's small, trembling body, the faint rise and fall of her chest, and felt the full weight of responsibility crush her. "She's weak," Eleanor said softly, almost pleading. "Fevered. I've done everything I could to care for her." You've cared for her," Nantan interrupted, voice softer now but heavy with grief. "And for that I will always be grateful. But she belongs with her people, with her blood, with the family that watches for her every step in the desert." Eleanor's fingers trembled as she reached for the cradle, wanting to cradle the child one last time before the inevitable separation, but Nantan's hands, steady and warm, gently took the infant into his arms. She pressed her tiny face against his chest, and he held her as though he could shield her from every harm in the world. "You must understand," he said quietly, so only Eleanor could hear. "I have searched for her every day since she was taken. I have followed footprints, questioned strangers, crossed rivers and ridges. And now at last I have found her." Eleanor felt a pang of guilt twist inside her. She had meant no harm. She had thought herself compassionate, brave even. And yet, confronted with the truth, she realized how fragile her intentions were against the weight of fate and family. Outside, the wind rose suddenly, rattling the shutters and sending dust dancing across the chapel floor. It was as if the desert itself demanded she make a choice. She drew a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the child's tiny form in Nantan's arms. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Take her." The word hung in the air, almost lost amid the soft cooing of the infant. Nantan's eyes softened, gratitude and relief flickering across his face. "Thank you," he said quietly. "For everything." Eleanor nodded, unable to speak. Her hands fell to her sides, empty, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the weight of solitude settle over her again. For a long moment, they stood like that, two strangers connected by a fragile, unspoken bond, the child between them as both a bridge and a boundary. Outside, the desert stretched endless, harsh and unforgiving. Inside, the chapel held a silence that was neither peace nor sorrow, but something in between. The kind of silence that comes after a choice has been made. Finally, Nantan turned toward the door, the infant cradled carefully against his chest. "I must go," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "There is danger ahead, but I will keep her safe." Eleanor watched him leave, each step echoing in her mind long after the door closed behind them. The cooing of the infant faded with the sound of retreating hooves, leaving only the wind, the dust, and the heavy stillness of a mission chapel that had witnessed something it could never forget. She sank to the floor, exhausted, trembling, and whispered to the empty room, "God help us all." The chapel felt hollow after Nantan left, the echoes of his footsteps lingering like a faint memory. Eleanor sat on the floor beside the cradle, now empty, staring at the soft indentations in the blanket where the child had slept. The faint scent of deerskin and warmth lingered in the air, as though the room itself remembered the baby's presence. Her mind replayed the encounter endlessly. The shell beads around the child's wrist, a tiny circle of white that marked her belonging. That was the key. That one detail held everything. It was simple yet profound. This child was not an orphan, not abandoned. She had a lineage, a history, a family that had survived despite the desert, the soldiers, the disease, and the uncertainty of life on the edge of civilization. Eleanor's chest tightened as she realized the full truth. For 2 nights she had been caring for a child who had been ripped from her mother's arms, a child who was part of a community that had searched for her desperately. The burden of good intentions now pressed heavily on her. Her kindness, her courage, her secrecy, all could not undo the deeper reality. She rose and walked toward the small window, the morning sun striking her face. Outside, the desert stretched endlessly, jagged and merciless, and in that harsh light she saw something she had not seen before. The fine trail of footprints in the dust, winding and careful, leading from the chapel door toward the horizon. A father, she realized, carrying hope in his arms, retracing steps that had led him to a miracle. A memory surfaced then, a fragment she had almost forgotten in the chaos of the past days. The child's mother, Eleanor remembered the way the baby had cried the first night, a faint, desperate sound that seemed to ask for something more than warmth or food. The mother must have left her in haste, knowing the soldiers were near, trusting someone she did not know to keep her child alive. That trust, heavy, silent, sacred, had been placed in Eleanor, and now she understood what that meant. She had been a guardian for only a fleeting moment, a bridge between danger and safety, between despair and reunion. Eleanor sank to the floor again, leaning against the wall, and let herself breathe. The revelation settled over her like a quiet storm. The child had been found, her mother's hope honored, and a man who had suffered for years had finally been reunited with what was rightfully his. Yet even in that relief, a shadow lingered. What of the soldiers? The colonel's instructions had been clear. She was not to act independently. She had acted. She had broken rules she barely understood, guided only by instinct and compassion. She had delivered the child to the rightful parent, but what would be the consequence? She pressed her hands to her face, feeling the weight of authority, the fragile line between duty and morality. And then there was Nantan. She realized, with a pang she could not name, that she had seen more than a scout or a warrior in him. She had seen a father, a man fractured by loss yet sustained by love. The sight of him holding the child, tenderly but firmly, had burned into her memory. There was no anger in his eyes toward her, only gratitude, sorrow, and the quiet acknowledgement of what she had risked. Eleanor allowed herself a small, bitter smile. Perhaps that was the desert's lesson, that human lives, fragile and transient, were bound not by law or fear, but by connection, by recognition, and by courage. That even a stranger could act as a lifeline. Her gaze drifted to the empty cradle. The room, though quiet, felt alive with what had passed through it, a story of survival, of loss, and of reunion. Eleanor realized that her role, however brief, had been pivotal. She had been the unseen hand guiding fate, the keeper of a secret too fragile to be understood fully by anyone else. The sun rose higher, casting long, sharp shadows across the chapel floor. The dust motes danced in the light like tiny spirits, bearing witness to the events that had unfolded. Eleanor pressed her palms to the floor, feeling the warmth of the earth beneath her, the pulse of the world outside, and she whispered a prayer for all involved, for the child, for Nantan, for the mother, for herself. A quiet determination settled over her. She would continue her work at the mission. She would teach, she would guide, she would protect. But now she understood deeply and irrevocably that the world beyond the adobe walls was harsh and wild, and that courage sometimes meant letting go. Outside, a hawk cried, circling the mesas. Eleanor watched it soar, feeling for the first time in days a strange sense of peace. The revelation was complete. She had been part of something greater than herself. And though the desert stretched endless and unforgiving, she knew that some threads of human connection, however fleeting, were unbreakable. The wind shifted outside, carrying the scent of dust and mesquite, a reminder that the desert never rested. Eleanor stood at the chapel door listening. For a long moment, all she heard was the soft cooing of the wind through the wooden beams and the distant cry of a hawk. She closed her eyes, drawing in a shaky breath, trying to summon calm. Then the sound came, the hard, deliberate stomp of boots on dry earth. Soldiers, not one, but a group, their rifles catching the sunlight, glinting like cold promises of danger. Eleanor's heart thudded in her chest. The colonel's warning replayed in her mind like a drumbeat. Do not act independently. Await instruction. She had already acted. She had already given the child to Nantan. The soldiers reached the chapel and stopped, spreading out. Their sergeant, a tall man with a face like carved stone, stepped forward. "Miss Briggs," he barked. "Step away from the door." Eleanor's pulse raced. She wanted to comply, to step aside and offer no resistance. Yet she knew the instant Nantan appeared, holding the child in his arms, the soldiers would fire. She swallowed hard and glanced toward the alcove where the cradle had once been, now empty. The child gone, the danger gone, but not the consequences. Her gaze shifted back to the soldiers. "There's nothing here," she said, voice trembling but steady enough to carry over the wind. "No child. No one." The sergeant's eyes narrowed. "Do not lie to me, Miss Briggs. The scout Nantan is said to be here. Where is he?" Eleanor's mind raced. She had to choose her words carefully. One slip, one hesitation, and everything could collapse. "I don't know," she stammered. "He came to see the child and then he left. I swear I have not seen him since." The soldiers exchanged glances. Eleanor could feel the tension, heavy and electric like the charged air before a desert storm. She pressed her palms to the doorframe, steadying herself. Every instinct screamed for her to run, to hide, but she knew that even if she did, the truth would follow. From the distance came the faint sound of hooves. Her heart leapt. Nantan, he was returning. The soldiers tensed immediately, rifles raising instinctively. Eleanor raised her hands. "Please," she cried, the word raw and desperate. A plea not to them but to fate itself. The sergeant barked an order, and the rifles leveled in the direction of the sound. Eleanor felt her knees weaken. The child, Nantan, the soldiers, everything was on the edge of disaster. Her voice rose again. "Please wait." "Don't fire!" The soldiers hesitated. Her plea, small and human, had given them pause. Nantan's figure appeared over the ridge, silhouetted against the brightening sky. The child cradled carefully in his arms. He moved with deliberate calm, a father's caution, a warrior's precision. Eleanor stepped forward, trying to create a buffer between him and the soldiers. "Sergeant," she called, her voice firm despite the fear clawing at her. "He is only here to take the child home. Please listen. She is his daughter. He has searched for her for days. He will not harm her." The sergeant's eyes flicked between her and Nantan. He saw the child, saw the trust in Eleanor's stance, saw the steady, unyielding gaze of a man whose only intention was love and reunion. Still, the tension in his shoulders betrayed caution. Orders were orders, and disobedience could mean court-martial, even death. Nantan stopped a few paces away, lowering the child slightly. His dark eyes met Eleanor's, and for a moment no one spoke. It was a quiet, electric pause, a fragile equilibrium held only by trust, desperation, and hope. Eleanor's hands trembled, but her voice rang out again. "Please," she whispered, "do not make this harder than it has to be. He is not your enemy. He is a father. The child, she belongs with him." The wind gusted, sweeping dust across the desert floor. The soldiers' rifles wavered. Eleanor could feel the weight of the moment, the impossible decision hanging over them like a blade poised to fall. And then slowly, the sergeant lowered his weapon, though his eyes remained cautious, wary, unyielding. Eleanor's chest heaved. The plea had been heard. Fate had paused, and in the quiet that followed, the desert seemed to exhale, carrying with it the fragile hope that what was right could survive the rigid demands of duty and law. The chapel seemed suspended in time. Dust swirled in the shafts of morning light, drifting lazily like spirits of the desert watching silently. Eleanor stood between the soldiers and Nantan, her body tense, every nerve alive with anticipation. The child, cradled against Nantan's chest, stirred slightly, letting out a soft whimper. The sound felt like a heartbeat echoing through the space, fragile, urgent, demanding protection. Eleanor's eyes darted between the two forces in the room. On one side were the soldiers, rifles raised, faces taut with discipline and suspicion. Their orders were clear: recover the child, detain the scout, enforce the law. On the other side was Nantan, a single man weary from days of tracking, a father holding the child that belonged to him, eyes burning with quiet resolve. Her mind raced. The colonel's warning echoed again, a distant drumbeat in her head. Do not act independently. Await instruction. But the moment had already arrived, and waiting was no longer an option. Eleanor felt the weight of the child's life, of Nantan's long search pressing on her conscience. She had to act. Step away, the sergeant barked, his voice slicing through the tension like a whip. Eleanor's stomach tightened. Every instinct screamed fear, but every fiber of her being screamed something louder. Justice, compassion, the undeniable right of a father to his child. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. No, she said firmly, louder this time, her voice echoing off the wooden walls. You will not take her from him. The soldiers flinched at the defiance, exchanging uneasy glances. The sergeant's jaw tightened. Miss Briggs, stand aside. That scout is under my orders. You cannot interfere. Eleanor's hands trembled, but she held them at her sides. I am interfering, she admitted. Because it is right. The child is his daughter. She belongs with him, not in a soldier's custody. Nantan's dark eyes met hers, and she saw the faintest flicker of relief. Trust, gratitude, understanding. He shifted the child slightly, holding her closer to his chest. She has no voice here, he said quietly. You speak for her. Thank you. The soldiers hesitated. The tension in the room became almost unbearable. The charged silence before a desert storm, each second stretching like eternity. Eleanor knew that the next moments could decide everything. The child's safety, Nantan's freedom, her own standing with the mission and the fort. The child stirred again, raising tiny fists, sensing the emotions that swirled around her. Eleanor's heart clenched. She could not let fear dictate her actions. She had to choose morality over obedience, compassion over law. Please, she said, her voice now a whisper, yet trembling with authority. Do not make a mistake that can never be undone. Do not punish him for doing what you could not understand. Let him take her home. The sergeant's eyes flicked toward Nantan, searching for any sign of threat. He saw none. Only a weary man holding his child, standing quietly waiting. And then he saw Eleanor, her gaze unwavering, her stance unyielding. Her plea carried weight, moral and human, that even discipline could not dismiss. Finally, the sergeant lowered his rifle slowly, reluctantly, the tension in his shoulders easing just enough to show that he would not act without further orders. The other soldiers followed suit, though their eyes remained wary. Eleanor exhaled a shaky breath, feeling the pressure leave her chest in a small, imperceptible wave. She looked at Nantan. His eyes were soft now, a mixture of gratitude, relief, and quiet exhaustion. He shifted the child slightly, allowing Eleanor a closer glance at her daughter. The baby's small face, now calm in her father's arms, seemed to recognize the safety that had been restored. The wind outside blew more gently now, rustling the chapel's wooden beams, carrying with it a whisper of the desert. Approval, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that the right choice had been made. Eleanor felt a strange, unexpected peace settle over her. The moment of choice had passed, and though the path forward was uncertain, she had acted in accordance with what her heart knew to be just. For a long while, no one spoke. Only the soft cooing of the child and the quiet, rhythmic sound of distant hooves marked the passing of time. Eleanor realized that in that fragile, tense pause, the boundaries between duty and morality, law and love, had been tested, and she had chosen the path of humanity. Finally, Nantan spoke, his voice low and reverent. Thank you, he said, not just for her words, but for the courage that had allowed him to claim what was his. Eleanor nodded, a faint smile on her lips. Outside, the desert seemed brighter, sharper, alive with possibility. She had faced the impossible and chosen right over fear, and somehow she knew that choice had changed everything. The sun hung high over the desert, blazing down on the mission chapel with an unforgiving glare. The dust, stirred by the morning wind, clung to everything, the wooden benches, the adobe walls, and the hearts of those who had stood within. Eleanor watched silently from the doorway as Nantan adjusted the child in his arms, her small body rising and falling with weak but steady breaths. The soldiers, still tense, lingered behind, reluctant to act but unwilling to leave entirely. The sergeant's eyes were sharp, scanning the horizon for reinforcements or signs of disobedience. Eleanor felt the weight of every glance, every order, every law pressing down on her like a storm. And yet she could not bring herself to regret the choice she had made. Nantan stepped toward his horse, moving deliberately, cautiously. Eleanor's heart pounded. She knew the desert beyond the chapel was treacherous, and the soldiers' rifles could fire in an instant. Every step he took was a risk, yet each step carried hope. For the child, for the reunion of a family, for the fragile justice she had tried to preserve. "Go carefully," Eleanor whispered, though he could not hear her over the rising wind. "Be safe." He paused and looked back once, eyes meeting hers. In that silent glance she saw gratitude, exhaustion, and the deep wordless bond between a father and his child. No words could carry what that look conveyed: relief, love, and a promise to survive. Then, with a sudden surge of courage, he swung onto the horse, the child held securely against his chest. The animal snorted and pawed at the ground, sensing the tension in the air. Nantan nudged it forward, and it moved slowly at first, then picking up speed, hooves kicking up clouds of red dust that curled and twisted like smoke in the desert sun. Eleanor watched, breath held, as he disappeared into the horizon. She could see the faint outline of the ridge he would cross, the dry riverbeds he would follow, the endless mesas that would guide him toward safety. And yet she knew the soldiers would follow soon, their boots crunching over stone and sand, their orders clear. A sharp voice behind her broke the spell. "Miss Briggs," the sergeant barked. "You've broken the law." Eleanor turned slowly, letting her eyes meet his. She did not flinch. "I've kept a life safe," she said quietly but firmly.
"That is more important than law." The sergeant's jaw tightened, but even he could see the truth in her words.
The desert wind whistled through the chapel windows, carrying with it a faint echo of hooves in the distance, a reminder that the right choice had already been made. The soldiers did not move forward. Perhaps it was caution, perhaps respect, or perhaps the unspoken understanding that some things could not be undone. Eleanor let herself exhale, a long, trembling breath, feeling the tension in her body slowly release. The chapel was silent again, but the silence was different this time. Lighter, almost sacred. Dust swirled lazily in the shafts of sunlight, and Eleanor felt the weight of the past days lift slightly. She walked to the alcove where the cradle had once been, now empty, and touched it gently. It was more than wood and fabric. It had been a vessel of hope, a symbol of trust, a bridge between fear and courage. Days, perhaps weeks later, Eleanor would find a single white shell bead left on her windowsill. She would recognize it immediately, a token of thanks, a message carried on the wind, small but infinitely meaningful. It would remind her that even in a world harsh and unforgiving, acts of kindness, bravery, and moral courage could resonate far beyond their brief moment. Eleanor straightened, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. The mission, the desert, the lonely mesas stretched endlessly around her. She had faced impossible choices, navigated fear and authority, and preserved life in the face of rigid law. And though the path forward was uncertain, she understood now that courage was not measured by obedience, but by the willingness to act for what is right. She looked toward the horizon, imagining Nantan and the child moving through the desert, each step carrying them toward safety, toward family, toward the life that had been stolen and reclaimed. And in that moment, Eleanor whispered to herself softly, with awe and relief, "Go. Be safe. Be home." The wind carried her words into the desert, mingling with the dust and the sunlight, and for a brief, perfect moment, the world seemed at peace,